There is a particular hesitation that has entered your conversations, and it is so small that others cannot immediately accuse it. It appears as a pause before you answer a question that once flowed automatically. The pause is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply arrives, settles, and stays. You notice that when you speak after it, your voice has not hardened, but it has thinned. Something unnecessary has been removed. Those around you sense the change before they can interpret it. They feel it as a loss of traction. They do not yet know what they have lost. Only that something that used to respond has stopped responding in the same way. You are not withdrawn in the sense people imagine. You still appear, you still answer when required, you still perform the minimal rituals of social continuity. Yet a certain door no longer opens. When concern is offered, it does not pass through you as it once did. When guilt is suggested, it does not land. When urgency is implied, it fails to accelerate you. You observe this with a mild curiosity, not triumph. It is as though an inner clerk has quietly closed an office that no longer processes requests. Others sense the closure not through conflict, but through the absence of echo. What is unsettling to them is not that you are cold, it is that you are no longer readable. Your face still moves, but it does not confess. Your tone still responds, but it does not invite further entry. The old exchange depended on your permeability. Questions once reached you and came back carrying reassurance, explanation, or self-correction. Now the questions return lighter, unanswered in their deeper intention. This is experienced by others as disorientation. They try to restore the familiar rhythm by repeating themselves, by softening, by sharpening, by offering kindness, by implying disappointment. Each attempt assumes that the old channel still exists. None of them recognize that the channel itself has collapsed. You did not decide this in a single moment. There was no vow, no declaration. The change occurred quietly. As the title suggests, through a sequence of inner recognitions that completed themselves without ceremony. What fell apart was not your care, but the structure that required you to translate yourself endlessly for the comfort of others. What ended was not your empathy, but your obligation to make it continuously accessible. This distinction is crucial, and it is the reason others cannot name what has happened. They accuse you of being different, distant, altered, but they cannot point to an action. They cannot locate a scene of betrayal. There is nothing to argue with. That is what makes them uneasy. You notice how people now behave around you. Some become excessively polite, as if approaching a sealed room. Others become strangely urgent, pressing for clarity, asking if something is wrong, if they have offended you, if you are upset. A few grow cold, withdrawing preemptively, as though punishing you for a crime they cannot articulate. Each reaction reveals an unconscious dependency on your former availability. You are witnessing the collapse of a relational economy that relied on your emotional openness as currency. The collapse does not produce chaos at first. It produces confusion, and confusion, when it cannot be resolved, quickly turns to pressure. There is a moment when you realize that you are no longer compelled to answer certain questions, not because you are resisting, but because the questions no longer touch anything that requires defense. They circle you, but they do not enter. This is experienced internally as a loss of inner noise, the constant rehearsal of explanations, the anticipation of misunderstanding, the subtle readiness to repair these processes have gone quiet. Silence, in this sense, is not an absence, it is a structural change. It is the absence of intrusion. This is why the shift feels completed rather than ongoing. You are not in the middle of becoming silent, you are already silent where it matters. Jung would say that an unconscious contract has expired. For a long time, your relationships were governed by an agreement you never signed consciously. You would remain legible. You would make your inner movements available for inspection. You would translate discomfort into reassurance. In return, you would receive belonging, identity, and a sense of moral worth. When this contract functioned, it felt like virtue. When it failed, it felt like exhaustion. The ending of this contract does not feel like rebellion. It feels like inevitability. The psyche, when a structure no longer serves its survival or integrity, does not negotiate. It withdraws energy. This withdrawal is what others experience as danger, not because you have become hostile, but because they can no longer locate themselves through you. Their projections of goodness, of reliability, of emotional labor have lost their anchor. Projection requires a receptive surface. When that surface withdraws, the projected material collapses back onto the projector. This is why people around you appear more anxious, more irritable, more self-justifying. They are meeting their own material without your mediation. You are no longer absorbing what does not belong to you. There is a dream that often appears at this stage. Though it may not announce itself as significant, you find yourself standing in a corridor of a house you recognize as yours, yet it is longer than you remember. Doors line the walls, some familiar, some unknown. You try one door and find it locked. You try another, and it opens onto an empty room with a single chair. The chair is not broken. It is simply unused. Light enters from a high window, winter light, pale and exact. You do not feel fear in the dream. You feel a mild disappointment, quickly replaced by acceptance. You stop trying doors, you stand in the corridor, and the dream ends. This dream is not about loss, it is about reclassification. Rooms that once served a function no longer do. The house has not collapsed. Its usage has changed. In waking life, this reclassification shows itself in small refusals that are not performed as refusals. You no longer volunteer emotional context. You no longer anticipate needs that have not been spoken responsibly. You no longer fill silences that do not belong to you. This is not a strategy. It is the natural consequence of an inner structure that has closed a door and sealed it. Others interpret this as withdrawal because they have no language for completed shifts. They only recognize process. Completion appears to them as absence. The danger, from a psychological perspective, lies in the loss of leverage. When you were readable, your guilt could be activated, your sense of responsibility could be appealed to, your fear of being misunderstood could be used to extract explanation. These were not malicious acts on the part of others, they were habitual. They belonged to a system that functioned because you participated. Now the system fails. Attempts to restore it become more explicit. You may notice a sudden increase in moral language directed at you, questions about your kindness, your loyalty, your warmth. These are not observations. They are tools, testing whether the old access points still work. Inside you, something else has happened. Anger has not erupted. It has settled. It has taken on form. Jung understood that when anger is integrated rather than discharged, it becomes boundary, it becomes architecture. It no longer needs to announce itself because it is already present in the structure of the psyche. This is why you do not feel compelled to justify your distance. There is nothing to justify. The inner decision has already been made, though you may never have spoken it aloud. A second dream often accompanies this phase. You are holding a letter that has been sealed. You know it contains words you once would have sent immediately. You carry it through a landscape that feels transitional, neither city nor wilderness. At some point, you come to a body of water. The surface is still. You consider throwing the letter in, but instead you place it on the ground and walk away. When you look back, the letter is still there, untouched. You wake without relief or regret. This dream does not suggest repression. The letter is not destroyed. It is simply no longer delivered. Communication has not been denied. It has been relocated. What others experience now is the collapse of expectation. They expected repair. They expected explanation. They expected you to return to the familiar role after the disturbance passed. The disturbance has passed. That is precisely the problem. You have not returned. You cannot return because the structure that supported the role no longer exists. Roles require energy. The psyche does not supply energy to what it has outgrown. In Jungian terms, the persona that once organized your empathy has cracked, not shattered, but loosened. Behind it, a quieter organizing center has taken over. This center does not perform goodness. It does not argue for its rightness. It does not seek recognition. It simply governs. When the self begins to organize life in this way, it often appears to others as indifference. This is a misunderstanding. Indifference implies lack of value. What has occurred here is a change in valuation. What once demanded response no longer qualifies. You may notice that even when conflict arises, it does not hook you as it once did. Accusations slide past. Praise feels distant. The emotional field has flattened, not into numbness, but into clarity. You see where others are attempting to re-establish control, and you do not meet them there. This is experienced by them as loss. By you, it is experienced as quiet. What has quietly fallen apart is not your capacity for relationship, but the unconscious agreement that required you to be endlessly available in order to be acceptable. What has completed inside you is not withdrawal, but the end of emotional access as a right others could assume. What becomes visible next is not your inner state, but the reactions it provokes. People begin to circle the absence. They speak around it. They test its edges. Someone asks a question that is technically reasonable, but carries an older expectation beneath it that you will soften, explain, reassure, or repair. When that expectation is not met, there is a brief flicker of irritation. quickly masked by civility. Civility, in this phase, is often a disguise for loss of influence. You notice how conversations shorten, how pauses linger, how others glance away sooner than before. These are not acts of hostility. They are micro adjustments to a relational reality that no longer functions as it once did. You sense that some people now speak to you as if you are fragile, others as if you are dangerous. Neither perception is accurate, but both reveal confusion. Fragility is projected when your silence is interpreted as injury. Danger is projected when your silence is interpreted as refusal. In truth, the silence is neither. It is structural. It is the sound of a door that no longer opens, because there is nothing behind it that needs to be accessed by force or persuasion. What unsettles others is that they cannot determine which version of you they are dealing with. The old signals have stopped broadcasting. There is a particular discomfort that arises in group settings. You notice it when laughter fades a second too early after you speak, or when a topic is quickly changed. The group senses that you are no longer playing the same game, though you have not declared new rules. This creates a subtle instability. Social systems rely on predictability, especially emotional predictability. When one person exits that predictability without explanation, the system compensates by tightening or excluding. Neither response restores balance. Both expose the dependency that existed on your former participation. Inside you, there is no drama corresponding to this external turbulence. That is perhaps the most disorienting aspect. You are not struggling with whether to engage. You are not rehearsing responses. The old inner debates have gone silent. This absence of inner conflict is what marks the shift as completed. Jung observed that when a complex loses its charge, it does not announce its departure, it simply stops organizing behavior. What once compelled you now registers as neutral information. This neutrality is often mistaken by others for judgment. They feel seen but not met. And in that gap, they insert their own conclusions. You begin to notice how often people speak to you about themselves now, rather than with you. They fill the space you no longer occupy. They explain, justify, narrate. This is not intimacy. It is compensation. Without your former mirroring, they are forced into monologue. Some find this intolerable. Others find it revealing. In either case, the relational symmetry has changed. You are no longer the emotional surface upon which their self-understanding is reflected. Another dream emerges around this time, less narrative and more fragmentary. You are standing before a mirror that does not reflect your face. Instead, it reflects a hallway behind you. You turn, but the hallway is not there. You look back at the mirror, and the image remains unchanged. There is no anxiety in the dream, only a slight disorientation. This image speaks to the withdrawal of projection. The mirror that once returned identity yours and others now returns absence. Identity has relocated away from reflection and into something less visible, less negotiable. In waking life, this relocation expresses itself as a loss of urgency. You no longer rush to correct misunderstandings about yourself. You no longer feel the need to clarify your intentions. Misinterpretation, which once felt dangerous, now feels inconsequential. This does not come from apathy, but from a deeper recognition your inner position no longer depends on being accurately perceived. When this dependency dissolves, a great deal of social leverage dissolves with it. Others may accuse you, quietly or openly, of having changed values. What has changed is not value, but valuation. Jung spoke of individuation not as improvement, but as differentiation. Differentiation always appears antisocial at first, because it withdraws from collective expectation. The collective experiences this withdrawal as loss, sometimes as betrayal, yet from the standpoint of the psyche, it is neither, it is alignment. When alignment occurs, the psyche ceases to offer itself as a solution to other people's unresolved tensions. This is why attempts to provoke you now feel strangely transparent. You see the mechanism without being pulled into it. There is a recurring symbol that begins to appear in your thoughts, not always as image, sometimes as sensation, a closed door that you do not attempt to open. You pass it daily, perhaps in imagination, perhaps in dream, and it does not trouble you. The door is not locked in a dramatic way. There is no sign forbidding entry. It is simply closed, and you have no reason to open it. This symbol marks the end of negotiation. Not negotiation with others, but negotiation within yourself about whether you are allowed to close something. Permission is no longer sought because it is no longer needed. As this becomes apparent, certain relationships begin to thin, invitations slow, messages become shorter or more formal. In some cases, there is a sudden intensification, an effort to pull you back through familiarity, nostalgia, or shared history. These efforts may feel almost tender, but they carry an unspoken demand. Return to what you were. You recognize this demand without resentment. Recognition replaces reaction, and because there is no reaction, the effort loses momentum. This is the quiet collapse the title points toward. It is not loud, it does not burn bridges, it allows them to decay naturally from lack of use. Your own experience of empathy has changed in quality. You still perceive others deeply, but perception no longer obligates response. This decoupling is often misunderstood, even by you at first. You may wonder whether you have become less caring. In fact, you have become more precise. Empathy without compulsion is clarity. It allows you to see suffering without absorbing it, confusion without correcting it, need without filling it. This precision is threatening to systems built on emotional extraction. They depended on your inability to separate seeing from serving. The unconscious mechanism beneath this shift is not avoidance, but compensation. For a long time, your psyche compensated for an external imbalance by overfunctioning internally. You carried meaning, continuity, and emotional labor beyond what was sustainable. When the compensation exhausted itself, the psyche did not ask for rest. It reorganized. The reorganization closed access points that had been overused. From the outside, this looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like coherence. There is often a moment when someone confronts you directly, asking what happened. The question is rarely neutral. It carries accusation or longing. You may notice that you do not have an answer that fits the question. Any explanation would require you to reopen what has closed. You sense this immediately, and so you respond minimally or not at all. This response frustrates the questioner because it denies them narrative closure. They want a story in which your change makes sense in familiar terms: hurt, anger, decision. What they cannot accept is that the change is not a story, but a condition. You are aware, perhaps dimly, that returning to the old pattern would require effort now. What was once automatic would have to be performed consciously. This reversal is significant. When a behavior moves from unconscious to conscious effort, it is no longer stable. The psyche resists sustaining it. This is why there is no temptation to go back, even when loneliness appears. Loneliness, in this phase, is informational. It tells you which connections were maintained by your labor alone. A final image begins to crystallize, sometimes in dream, sometimes in waking reverie, a staircase descending into a lower level of a familiar building. You stand at the top, aware that you have walked those steps many times before. This time, you do not descend. You notice that the railing is cold, that the light below is dim. You turn away without drama. This image is not about fear of depth. It is about the end of descent as obligation. You have already seen what is there. There is nothing more required. What is integrating now is not a new identity, but the shadow of your former goodness. The part of you that believed constant availability was virtue has been absorbed and neutralized. It no longer needs to argue with itself. Boundaries, in this state, are not asserted, they exist. They shape interaction without announcement. This is why others cannot negotiate with them. Negotiation requires access. Access has ended. You may notice a peculiar calm when you imagine never returning to certain roles. There is no triumph in this calm. There is no grief either. It is the calm of recognition. Something has completed, and completion does not ask to be celebrated. It simply withdraws its energy from what is finished. What quietly fell apart was a relational structure built on your perpetual openness. And what does not return is the version of you that made that structure possible. What becomes more apparent now is the way authority rearranges itself around you. Not social authority, not positional power, but the subtle authority that once came from your emotional availability. When that availability ended, something else stepped forward. It is quieter, less performative, and far less interested in being recognized. Others sense it without understanding it. They respond with caution or defiance, sometimes alternating between the two. This oscillation is revealing. It shows where they once relied on your responsiveness to regulate their own position. Without it, they must locate themselves internally, and many are unprepared to do so. You may notice that people begin to speak about you rather than to you. Conversations happen in parallel rather than in contact. This is not exclusion in the dramatic sense. It is displacement. When direct access fails, indirect channels multiply. Speculation replaces dialogue. Stories circulate, attempting to explain your change in ways that preserve the old hierarchy. You are described as tired, wounded, aloof, changed by circumstances. Each description is an effort to domesticate what has occurred. None of them succeed. because the shift did not arise from circumstance, it arose from within, and inner completions do not submit to external narratives. Inside, there is an increasing sense of spatial clarity. You become aware of where you end and others begin in a way that does not require vigilance. Before, boundaries were maintained through effort, through anticipation, through monitoring tone, through adjusting yourself to prevent friction. Now the boundary is structural. It does not need guarding because it is no longer porous. This produces a peculiar freedom that is not euphoric. It is neutral, almost austere. The psyche has simplified itself. Jung noted that when a complex dissolves, it often leaves behind a vacuum that others attempt to fill. In your case, the vacuum is not emotional emptiness, but the absence of role. You no longer occupy the position of emotional translator, moral buffer, or relational stabilizer. Others rush to fill that space. Sometimes by escalating their behavior, they become more dramatic, more righteous, more insistent. These escalations are not about you. They are attempts to restore equilibrium without altering their own structure. Because you no longer respond, the escalations exhaust themselves. There is a moment when someone attempts to provoke you deliberately. They say something sharp, something unfair, something designed to draw out the old defense or apology. You register the attempt without shock. It does not wound you. It does not anger you. It simply fails to land. This failure is unsettling for the one who provoked it. Provocation requires participation. Without participation, it collapses into exposure. The aggressor becomes visible to themselves, and that visibility is often intolerable. They retreat, or they harden. Either way, the dynamic has changed irreversibly. Another dream often surfaces here, quieter than the previous ones. You are in a familiar room, perhaps a kitchen or study, and an empty chair sits across from you. You know someone is meant to sit there, someone who once did. You wait briefly, without impatience. The chair remains empty. You do not feel abandoned. You simply stand up and leave the room. The dream ends without resolution. This image marks the end of expectation. Waiting has ceased to be a posture. Presence is no longer contingent on another's arrival. In waking life, this translates into a reduced tolerance for performative connection. You notice when conversations are driven by anxiety rather than interest, by obligation rather than curiosity. Where you once would have compensated, asked questions, offered warmth, bridged gaps, you now allow the gap to remain. This allowance is not cruelty, it is accuracy. You are no longer smoothing over discontinuities that reveal misalignment. The psyche, aligned with itself, refuses to lie on behalf of the relationship. This refusal is experienced by others as a moral problem. They may accuse you, implicitly or explicitly, of having become less kind, less generous, less human. Jung understood this accusation well. When individuation advances, collective values feel threatened. The individual is judged by standards that no longer apply to their inner organization. What others call kindness was often compliance. What they call generosity was often self-erasure. The psyche, once it recognizes this, does not argue, it withdraws consent. You may find yourself increasingly uninterested in explaining your inner world. This is not secrecy, it is irrelevance. Explanation belongs to a phase where understanding by others was necessary for self-coherence. That necessity has ended. Your inner coherence no longer depends on being mirrored. As a result, silence acquires a different quality. It is not defensive, it is complete. Others feel this completeness as exclusion because they are accustomed to access. They interpret your quiet as withholding, when in fact there is nothing being held back. The door is not guarded, it is simply closed. There is a recurring bodily sensation that accompanies this stage, a lightness in the chest, sometimes mistaken for emptiness. It appears when you realize you are not responsible for managing another's emotional reaction. The sensation is subtle, almost imperceptible, but once noticed, it becomes unmistakable. It is the body registering a reduction in burden. The nervous system, long accustomed to vigilance, begins to recalibrate. This recalibration does not feel like relief. It feels like neutrality. The absence of threat reveals how constant the threat once was. At this point, the social consequences sharpen. Certain people drift away entirely. Others maintain contact but with a new formality. A few become openly resentful. Resentment, here, is not caused by harm, it is caused by the loss of entitlement. When someone has grown accustomed to your emotional labor, its absence feels like deprivation. They frame it as injustice. They speak of fairness, reciprocity, balance. What they mean is that the old arrangement benefited them, and its ending exposes their dependency. You observe these reactions without pleasure or pain. Observation has replaced participation. This shift can feel uncanny. You are present, yet not entangled. You see patterns without stepping into them. Jung would describe this as the ego relinquishing its identification with certain roles, allowing the self to assume governance. The self does not negotiate roles. It organizes life according to necessity, not approval. When it does so, relationships reorganize or dissolve accordingly. There is often a temptation, subtle and fleeting, to re-enter the old pattern out of nostalgia. You remember moments of closeness, shared meaning, mutual reliance. The memory is real. What is no longer real is the structure that sustained it. You sense that returning would require you to diminish yourself, to reopen a wound that has closed. This recognition is immediate and quiet. Nostalgia passes. The psyche does not punish itself for longing. It simply does not act on it. Another symbol begins to repeat in your inner life: winter light. Not darkness, not night, but a clear, cold illumination that reveals edges sharply. Under this light, things appear exactly as they are. There is no warmth to blur outlines. This light is not hostile. It is honest. Under it, you see which connections were built on mutual recognition and which were built on your accommodation. The former may remain, the latter cannot survive without your participation. You may notice that your anger, when it appears, is brief and contained. It does not spiral. It does not seek expression. It registers information and then recedes. This is anger that has been metabolized. It no longer needs to protect the psyche because the structure itself now provides protection. This is what integrated shadow looks like, not aggression, but solidity. Boundaries are no longer reactive, they are inherent. As this solidity becomes apparent, attempts to manipulate you grow more transparent, appeals to guilt, urgency, or moral obligation fail quickly. You recognize them as echoes of a previous era. You do not confront them. Confrontation would imply engagement. You simply do not respond in the expected way. This non-response is often interpreted as passive resistance. In truth, it is neither passive nor resistant. It is absence of entry. There is a subtle grief that may pass through you, not for what you lost, but for what never truly existed. You recognize how much of your relational life was sustained by your effort alone. This recognition is sobering, but it does not collapse you. It clarifies. Grief here is not a process to be worked through. It is a moment of seeing. Once seen, it integrates and dissolves. The social field around you now feels quieter. Even when populated, noise has reduced because the constant negotiations have ended. You are no longer managing impressions, correcting misunderstandings, or preempting disappointment. The reduction in noise reveals a deeper silence, one that is not empty but settled. In this silence, you sense that something irreversible has occurred, not because of a decision, but because of an ending. What is becoming unmistakable is that the empath who once returned again and again to repair, to explain, to soften, is no longer available, not withdrawn, not hidden, but structurally absent. The psyche has closed a chapter without marking the page. Others search for the bookmark. You know there is none. What follows is not escalation, but stabilization. The field around you settles into a new arrangement, one that no longer orbits your responsiveness. This settling can feel strangely anticlimactic. There is no final confrontation, no moment of collective realization. People simply adapt, each in their own way. Some adjust their expectations and remain. Others drift quietly, as if the connection had always been provisional. A few harden into narratives about you that preserve their sense of coherence. You do not correct these narratives. Correction would imply that you still require alignment. You do not. You become aware that your presence now carries a different weight. When you speak, words land more precisely, not because you are more articulate, but because you speak less to manage and more to name. Silence surrounds your speech rather than filling its gaps. Others listen differently, sometimes with caution, sometimes with an unease they cannot explain. They sense that words spoken to you will not be absorbed and reshaped for comfort. What they offer will return to them largely unchanged. This alters how freely they speak. Some experience this as respect, others experience it as threat. There is a subtle shift in how time feels in your interactions. Conversations no longer stretch indefinitely. They end when they end. You do not prolong them to maintain harmony. You do not rush them to avoid discomfort. Time is allowed to take its shape. This temporal honesty exposes which connections relied on your elasticity. Without it, they compress or snap. This is not something you cause. It is something that happens when a structure that once bore weight is removed. Internally, there is a growing sense of inevitability, not fate, not destiny, but the inevitability that accompanies recognition. Once a psychic truth has been fully recognized, it cannot be unseen. You cannot unlearn the fact that your openness was being used as scaffolding for others' stability. You cannot unknow how little remained when you stopped providing it. This knowledge does not embitter you, it steadies you. Bitterness belongs to ongoing struggle. You are no longer struggling. Another dream may appear, brief and unspectacular. You are holding a broken key, not snapped in half, but worn smooth, its teeth eroded from use. You recognize that it once opened many doors. You turn it in your hand, noticing its uselessness without anger. You place it on a table and walk away. There is no attempt to replace it. This dream marks the end of access as skill. You no longer possess the tool that unlocked others because you no longer require entry. In waking life, this translates into a diminished impulse to be understood. Misunderstanding no longer threatens your integrity. You allow others to misread you without urgency. This is often interpreted as arrogance or withdrawal. In truth, it is self-containment. The psyche, once organized around external validation, has reoriented itself. Validation has become internal, quiet, almost invisible. Others cannot engage with it because it does not perform. You may notice that your emotional responses have become slower, not dulled, but delayed. You feel, but you do not immediately express. Expression waits for necessity. This waiting unsettles those accustomed to immediate feedback. They probe, asking how you feel, what you think, whether something is wrong. Their questions assume that access is still possible if they find the right angle. You recognize the assumption without irritation. You answer briefly or not at all. The probing eventually ceases. Not because it was answered, but because it failed. Jung wrote of the danger that accompanies individuation, not the danger of collapse, but the danger of isolation. Yet isolation, in this phase, is not loneliness, it is separation. Separation from roles that once defined you, from expectations that once governed you. This separation is often misinterpreted as loss. In reality, it is differentiation. You are no longer fused with others' needs, moods, or narratives. This differentiation creates space. Space, initially, feels empty, then it feels accurate. Within this space, you begin to notice how rarely you are compelled to justify yourself. Justification belonged to a world where your actions were measured against external standards you had internalized. Those standards have loosened their hold. You act now according to an inner metric that does not seek agreement. This does not make you unaccountable, it makes you anchored. Accountability here is to something deeper than approval. The relational consequences continue to unfold without drama. Some people test you one last time, offering a crisis, a confession, a need that once would have activated you immediately. You feel the familiar impulse flicker, then settle. You recognize the pattern without stepping into it. This recognition is instantaneous. The psyche no longer debates. Debate would imply uncertainty. Certainty has already arrived. There is a recurring image in your waking awareness, a corridor narrowing into a single path. not claustrophobic, not dark, simply clear. Side doors are gone, distractions have fallen away. You move forward without urgency. This image is not aspirational, it is descriptive. Life has simplified itself around what is essential. What remains is not necessarily comfortable, but it is coherent. You may find that anger, when directed at you now, feels strangely distant. Words meant to wound pass through without embedding. This is not numbness. It is insulation. The psyche has thickened its skin, not to defend against life, but to prevent unnecessary penetration. This thickening is the result of experience, not choice. It does not make you invulnerable, it makes you selective. As the external field stabilizes, you become aware of a quiet satisfaction that does not announce itself. Satisfaction is perhaps too strong a word. It is more like alignment. Things are where they belong. You are no longer contorting yourself to maintain bonds that required contortion. This alignment does not produce happiness in the conventional sense. It produces steadiness. Steadiness replaces hope. Hope belonged to a time when repair was possible. Repair is no longer relevant. Others may still wait for you to return to what you were. They hold on to this expectation because it preserves their sense of continuity. You sense their waiting without responding to it. Waiting, on their part, does not obligate you. Obligation ended when the inner contract dissolved. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect for them to accept. They believed your return was guaranteed by your nature. They did not consider that nature itself could reorganize. In Jungian terms, what has occurred is a withdrawal of projection and a consolidation of the self. The empathic function has been integrated rather than externalized. You no longer live in the space between others' needs and your response. You live within your own psychic boundaries. This consolidation is irreversible because it is structural. Structures do not regress without collapse. There is no collapse here, there is completion. You may occasionally glance back at your former self with a kind of neutrality, not disdain, not longing. You recognize the necessity of that phase. It brought you here, yet you also recognize that returning would require dismantling what has been built. There is no impulse to do so. The psyche protects its own integrity without sentimentality. The world around you continues, populated by people still operating under older contracts. You move among them without contempt. You simply do not participate in what no longer applies. This non-participation is not announced. It is enacted through absence of response, absence of explanation, absence of repair. Absence here is not emptiness, it is boundary. What has quietly fallen apart is the relational structure that depended on your perpetual emotional return. And what has completed inside you is the end of access.